I'm Jessica Martinez, 24 years old, and 3 days ago I graduated from the University of Texas with a master's degree in emergency management. But the person who should have been proudest wasn't there to see it. My brother Carlos, the same man who left me trapped in a flooding duplex during Hurricane Petra while he drove to safety with our emergency supplies and our father's medication. What he didn't know was that the Red Cross coordinator who pulled me from those rising waters would become more than just my rescuer. She'd become the family I always needed but never had. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Galveston, Texas, hurricanes were just part of life, like humidity and seafood festivals. Our duplex on Avenue O sat 3 blocks from the seawall, close enough to smell the Gulf on windy days but far enough back that we'd never worried too much about storm surge. Carlos and I had weathered plenty of storms together in that old house. Our grandparents left us, playing cards by candlelight when the power went out, making jokes about our neighbors who evacuated for every tropical depression. Carlos was 5 years older than me, and after Mom died in that car accident 2 years ago, he stepped into this protective big brother role that honestly felt natural. He'd always been the one to check the hurricane shutters, stock up on water and batteries, make sure our generator was working. When Dad's dementia started getting worse, and we had to move him to Sunset Manor, Carlos handled all the paperwork, the insurance calls, the difficult conversations with doctors. I was grateful to have someone take charge because I was drowning in my own responsibilities. At 24, I was working full-time at the Galveston Community College Library while finishing my EMT certification in the evenings. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and I loved helping students research their papers or find resources for their classes. Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, had become something of a mentor, encouraging me to think about going back to school myself. She'd often say that I had a natural ability to stay calm in chaotic situations, whether it was dealing with frustrated students or managing the library during finals week when everyone was stressed and desperate. Carlos, on the other hand, had bigger dreams. After Mom's funeral, he'd started talking about opportunities in Houston, real estate deals that could set us both up for life. He'd drive up there twice a month, coming back with stories about luxury developments and investment properties, showing me photos on his phone of gleaming office buildings and waterfront condos. He claimed to be working with some high-powered developers, learning the business from the inside. Our routine was comfortable, predictable. Sunday dinners together, usually takeout from Shrimp and Stuff, while we watched whatever game was on. Carlos would update me on his Houston ventures. I'd tell him about my EMT classes or share funny stories from the library. We'd visit Dad together every Wednesday evening, bringing him his favorite chocolate chip cookies from the bakery on the Strand. Dad's good days were becoming rarer, but when he was lucid, he'd tell us how proud he was of us, how we were taking care of each other, just like Mom would have wanted. The duplex itself held so many memories that sometimes walking through it felt like moving through our family history. The kitchen table where Mom had helped me with homework every night, the living room where Carlos taught me to play guitar during one particularly long summer, the back porch where we'd all sit during mild storms, watching the rain and lightning over the Gulf. After Mom died, Carlos had suggested we sell the place and split the money, but I couldn't bear the thought of losing that connection to her. Looking back, there were signs I should have paid attention to. Carlos's trips to Houston became more frequent, sometimes lasting 3 or 4 days. When I'd ask for details about his real estate projects, his answers became vague, full of industry jargon that didn't quite add up. He started getting phone calls at odd hours, conversations he'd take outside or in his room with the door closed. Once, I found him at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, staring at his laptop with this expression I'd never seen before. Desperate, maybe even scared. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd flash that charming smile that had been getting him out of trouble since we were kids. "Just working on something big, Jess," he'd say, "something that's going to change everything for us." He'd started using phrases like ground floor opportunity and cryptocurrency futures, terms that sounded impressive but felt empty, when I pressed him for specifics. The phone calls became more frequent, and I noticed Carlos getting jumpy whenever his cell rang. He'd check the caller ID, and sometimes let it go to voicemail, his face tight with tension. When I asked about it, he'd dismiss my concerns, saying it was just business partners wanting updates on deals that were still in negotiation. But business partners don't usually call at midnight, and they don't usually make people look like they're about to throw up. Carlos also started asking me questions about my savings, casual inquiries about my emergency fund, and whether I'd ever considered investing in something with higher returns than my credit union savings account. He'd bring up articles he'd read about young people building wealth through smart investments, how traditional savings were actually losing money due to inflation. When I mentioned that my emergency fund was exactly that Midas for emergencies, he'd nod approvingly, but I could see something calculating behind his eyes. The changes weren't just financial. Carlos began spending more money on clothes, upgrading his truck, taking expensive trips to Austin and Dallas that he claimed were for networking events. He'd come home with business cards from companies I'd never heard of, talking about partnerships and joint ventures that sounded impressive but never seemed to produce any actual results. When I'd ask how he was affording all this new spending, he'd say his Houston projects were starting to pay off, that I'd see the benefits soon enough. Our Wednesday visits to Dad became tense affairs. Carlos would get impatient when Dad repeated himself or forgot our names, checking his phone constantly during our conversations. Once, Dad asked Carlos directly about his work, and Carlos's explanation was so convoluted and full of contradictions that even Dad, with his dementia, looked confused. After that visit, Dad pulled me aside and said something that stuck with me. "That boy's running from something, Jessica. I may be old and forgetful, but I know the look of a man in trouble." The final warning sign came about a month before Hurricane Petra started forming in the Atlantic. Carlos received a registered letter that he signed for but wouldn't.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Open in front of me. He took it straight to his room, and I could hear him on the phone for hours afterward, his voice angry and defensive. When he came out for dinner, he was quiet, distracted, picking at his food while staring at his phone. When I asked what the letter was about, he said it was just legal paperwork for one of his investments, nothing to worry about. But I was starting to worry. The brother I'd grown up with, the one who'd held me during thunderstorms when I was little, who'd taught me to drive stick shift in the Walmart parking lot, who'd delivered Mom's eulogy with such grace and strength, that person was being replaced by someone I barely recognized. Someone secretive, anxious, and increasingly desperate. Someone who looked at me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a sister to be protected. Still, when the weather reports started mentioning a tropical disturbance that might threaten the Gulf Coast, Carlos snapped back into his familiar role as our family's emergency coordinator. He started checking the National Hurricane Center updates multiple times a day, making lists of supplies we'd need, testing the generator and the weather radio. For a few days, it felt like old times, like we were a team again, preparing to face whatever nature threw at us from our solid home base on Avenue O. I should have realized that Carlos's sudden return to normalcy was actually him calculating his exit strategy. While I saw hurricane preparation as us battening down together, he was planning how to get himself to safety while leaving me behind. The supplies he was gathering, the emergency cash he was counting, the full tank of gas in his truck, none of it was meant for both of us. It was all part of a plan I was too trusting to see coming. The irony is that I was studying emergency management principles in my EMT classes, learning about evacuation procedures and disaster response protocols. I could recite the stages of disaster management, explain the importance of communication and coordination during emergencies, describe the psychological factors that influence people's decision-making during crises. But I never applied any of that knowledge to my own family situation. I never considered that my own brother might view me as expendable when his back was against the wall. Hurricane Petra started as just another disturbance, one of dozens that form in the Atlantic every season. Most of them die out or turn harmlessly into the ocean, but this one kept growing, kept strengthening, kept tracking toward the Gulf of Mexico like it had a personal appointment with the Texas coast. By the time the National Hurricane Center started issuing watches and warnings for our area, Petra had become a Category 4 monster with sustained winds over 140 miles per hour and a storm surge forecast that made even the most hurricane-experienced residents of Galveston pay attention. Carlos and I spent Labor Day weekend preparing the duplex, boarding up windows, securing outdoor furniture, stocking up on food and water and batteries. We moved our most valuable possessions to the second floor, just in case. Carlos seemed focused and competent, the brother I remembered from previous storms, and I felt that familiar sense of security that came from knowing we'd face this challenge together, just like we'd faced everything else since Mom died. But as Hurricane Petra churned closer to the Texas coast, growing stronger and more dangerous by the hour, Carlos was making calculations that had nothing to do with our safety and everything to do with his own desperate situation. While I was preparing for us to shelter in place and ride out the storm together, he was preparing to abandon me to save himself. And the decision he was about to make would change both of our lives in ways neither of us could have imagined. The weekend before Hurricane Petra was forecast to make landfall, Carlos received 3 phone calls that changed everything. I was in the kitchen making coffee Sunday morning when his cell phone started ringing. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but Carlos's face went completely white when he saw it. He answered with a shaky hello, and immediately walked outside to the back porch, closing the door behind him. Through the window, I could see him pacing back and forth, his free hand running through his hair in that nervous gesture he'd had since childhood. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, but when he came back inside, he looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. His hands were actually trembling as he poured himself coffee, spilling some on the counter. "Everything okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned. Carlos had always been the steady one in our family, the person who kept his cool during crises. "Just business stuff," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "Nothing that can't be handled." But the second call came 2 hours later, and this time Carlos didn't even try to hide his panic. He answered with "I told you I need more time," and spent the next 15 minutes in what sounded like an argument. I could hear his voice getting louder and more desperate, even from the living room where I was trying to focus on my EMT textbook. When he came back in, I was shocked by how different he looked. The color had drained from his face completely, and there were beads of sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. "Carlos, you're scaring me," I said, closing my book and moving to sit across from him. "What's going on?" He looked up at me then, and for just a moment, I saw something that terrified me. Carlos looked desperate in a way I'd never seen before. But then he seemed to pull himself together, forcing that familiar smile that had been fooling people for years. "It's complicated, Jess," he said. "Some investments didn't go the way I expected. But I'm working on it. Everything's going to be fine." The third call came that evening while we were watching the weather coverage. Hurricane Petra had strengthened to a Category 4 storm, and was now projected to make direct landfall somewhere near Galveston. The meteorologists were using words like catastrophic and life-threatening, and the mayor was already hinting at a mandatory evacuation order that would probably come Monday morning. Carlos's phone rang again, and this time he just stared at it for several rings before answering. He didn't even bother going outside for privacy. I could hear both sides of the conversation clearly, and what I heard made my blood run cold. "I understand you want your money," Carlos said, his voice barely steady, "but I can't get it right now. The hurricane's coming, and everything's shut down until next week." The voice on the other end was loud enough for me to make out words like consequences and final warning. Carlos kept glancing at me while he talked, and I could see him making some kind of mental calculation. "Look," he said finally, "I'll have it by Wednesday. I just need to liquidate some assets. You'll get every penny plus interest." After he hung up, we sat in silence for a long time, watching the radar loop on the Weather Channel. The storm was massive, easily filling the entire Gulf of Mexico, with that telltale eye that meant serious business. "Carlos," I said quietly, "how much money are we talking about?" He was quiet for so long I didn't think he was going to answer. Then, without looking at me, he said 85,000. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. $85,000. How is that even possible? "Cryptocurrency," he said, still staring at the television. "I borrowed money to invest in what was supposed to be a sure thing. The market crashed, and now," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Who did you borrow from?" I asked, though I was already afraid of the answer. "People you don't want to owe money to," he said simply. The next morning, Monday, brought the official mandatory evacuation order for all of Galveston Island. Zone A residents, which included our neighborhood, were ordered to evacuate by 6 p.m. The storm was now forecast to make landfall Tuesday morning as a Category 4 hurricane with storm surge potentially reaching 15 feet. I expected Carlos to start loading the truck with our emergency supplies, getting ready for the drive inland to San Antonio, where we could stay with our cousin Maria until the storm passed. Instead, he spent the morning making phone calls and working on his laptop with an intensity that seemed completely disconnected from the approaching disaster. "We need to start packing," I told him around noon. "The highways are going to be jammed if we wait much longer." "Right," he said absently, not looking up from his screen. "Just give me a few more minutes to finish this." But those few minutes stretched into hours. At 3 p.m., I started loading the truck myself, carrying out the cases of water and boxes of food we'd bought over the weekend. Carlos was still on his laptop, now with papers spread all over the kitchen table. Bank statements, what looked like loan documents, printouts of emails. "Carlos, we need to go," I said, my voice sharp with anxiety. "The evacuation order isn't a suggestion." I know," he said, gathering up his papers. "I just need to make a few more calls." By 5 p.m., I was genuinely panicked. The wind had picked up noticeably, and the sky to the southeast was turning an ominous dark gray. Our neighbors had already left hours ago, and Avenue O looked like a ghost town. Carlos was in his room, and I could hear him talking on the phone, his voice alternating between pleading and angry. I knocked on his door. "Carlos, we have to leave now. If we wait any longer, we might not make it out safely." The door opened, and Carlos appeared with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. But instead of looking relieved to finally be leaving, he looked more stressed than ever. His phone was buzzing constantly with text messages, and he kept checking it obsessively. "Actually, Jess," he said, not meeting my eyes, "I need to go to Houston first. There's something I have to take care of before the storm." "Houston?" I stared at him in disbelief. "Carlos, Hurricane Petra is going to hit Houston too, and it's in the opposite direction from where we should be heading. It's just a quick stop," he said, still not looking at me directly. "A few hours, maybe overnight. You should go ahead to Maria's. I'll catch up with you there." Something cold settled in my stomach. We stick together during hurricanes. That's always been our rule. "This is different," he said, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "This is important, Jess, more important than you understand." "More important than our lives?" I asked, incredulous. Carlos finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes terrified me more than any approaching storm. Desperation had given way to something harder, more calculated. He was looking at me like I was an obstacle rather than his sister. "Go to Maria's," he said firmly. "I'll meet you there Wednesday morning, after the storm passes." "I'm not leaving without you," I said, crossing my arms. End of discussion. Carlos' phone buzzed again, and when he read the message, his face went completely pale. He looked at me, then at his phone, then back at me, and I could practically see him weighing options in his head. "Fine," he said finally. "But we leave for Houston in an hour, and Jess." His voice was strange, almost apologetic. "Pack light, just essentials." I should have pressed him for more details. I should have demanded to know exactly what was so important in Houston that it was worth risking our lives. I should have called Maria myself and told her to expect only me. Instead, I trusted my brother, the same brother who had protected me through every storm we'd ever faced together. I packed a small bag with clothes for a few days, my EMT textbook, and some toiletries, assuming we'd be back home by the end of the week to assess whatever damage Petra left behind. Carlos loaded the truck, while I secured the house one final time, making sure all the storm shutters were properly fastened, and the generator was ready to go for when we returned. The wind was really picking up now, and palm fronds were already starting to blow around the yard. We needed to get moving soon, or risk getting caught in the worst of the weather. When I came back outside, Carlos was standing by the truck with his phone pressed to his ear. He was saying something about collateral and good faith payment, and when he saw me approaching, he quickly ended the call. "Ready?" he asked, forcing that fake smile again. I climbed into the passenger seat, still uneasy about the whole plan, but trusting that Carlos knew what he was doing. As we pulled away from the duplex, I looked back at our family home, wondering when we'd see it again, and in what condition. The storm shutters made it look like a fortress, ready to withstand whatever Petra could throw at it. Carlos drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, checking his mirrors constantly like he expected to be followed. The radio was broadcasting constant updates about the hurricane, now just 12 hours from landfall, and maintaining its terrifying strength. Traffic was heavy but moving, mostly vehicles heading north and west away from the coast. About halfway to Houston, Carlos's phone rang again. He glanced at the caller ID, and his whole body tensed. This time he answered with speakerphone, and the voice that filled the truck cab made my blood freeze. "You're cutting it awfully close, Martinez," the voice said. It was cold, professional, with just a hint of accent I couldn't place. "Hurricane or no hurricane, we had a deal." "I know," Carlos said, his voice shaking. "I'm on my way. I'll have something for you tonight." "Something better be enough to show good faith," the voice said, "because if it's not, the weather's going to be the least of your problems." The line went dead, and Carlos immediately turned off the radio, plunging us into silence, except for the sound of wind buffeting the truck. I stared at him, my heart pounding. "Carlos, who was that?" I asked. "Nobody you need to worry about," he said, but his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. "That didn't sound like nobody," I said. "That sounded like somebody very dangerous." Carlos didn't answer, just kept driving toward Houston, while the storm of the century bore down on the Texas coast behind us. I was beginning to understand that the financial trouble Carlos had gotten himself into was far worse than he'd admitted, and that whatever plan he had for dealing with it, I was somehow part of it whether I knew it or not. The sky kept getting darker, and the wind kept getting stronger, and my brother kept getting more desperate. And I was starting to realize that the person I'd trusted with my life might be planning to trade that life to save his own. Part 3. The crisis escalates. We reached Houston just as the outer bands of Hurricane Petra began lashing the city with sheets of rain and gusting winds. The downtown skyline looked eerily empty, with most office buildings dark and abandoned. Carlos navigated through increasingly deserted streets, while I watched palm trees bend at impossible angles outside the passenger window. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked, as Carlos took an exit I'd never seen him use before. "Just need to meet someone," he said, his voice tight. "Won't take long." We pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel on the southwest side of the city. The neon sign flickered intermittently, and half the letters were burned out. This wasn't the kind of place Carlos would normally even drive past, let alone stop at. But he parked near room 127, and sat staring at the door for a long moment. "Carlos, I don't like this," I said. "We should be getting further inland, not stopping at some sketchy motel." Just stay in the truck, he said, grabbing a manila envelope from between his seat and the console. I'll be right back. What's in the envelope? Nothing that concerns you, he snapped, then immediately softened his tone. Just some paperwork. Give me 10 minutes. I watched him walk to room 127 and knock. The door opened immediately, like someone had been waiting right behind it. Carlos disappeared inside, and I was left alone in the truck listening to the wind howl and the rain hammer against the windows. 10 minutes became 20, then 30. The storm was getting worse by the hour, and I could see debris starting to fly through the parking lot. A traffic cone tumbled past, followed by what looked like pieces of a roof shingle. The weather radio I'd brought was issuing increasingly urgent warnings about life-threatening conditions along the coast. When Carlos finally emerged from the motel room, he looked even worse than when he'd gone in. His face was ashen, and he was moving with jerky, nervous gestures, but what really caught my attention was that he no longer had the envelope. What was in that envelope? I asked as soon as he got back in the truck. Just some documents, he said, not meeting my eyes. What kind of documents? Carlos started the engine without answering, and pulled out of the parking lot. Instead of heading north toward San Antonio like I expected, he turned south, back toward the coast. Where are we going now? I demanded. There's one more stop I need to make, he said. Carlos, the hurricane is about to make landfall. We need to get inland, not closer to the water. I know what I'm doing, he said, but his voice lacked any conviction. We drove for another hour, through increasingly dangerous conditions. Trees were down across several roads, forcing Carlos to take detours through neighborhoods I didn't recognize. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and the truck was being buffeted by winds that had to be at least 60 miles per hour. Finally, Carlos pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner that somehow still had its lights on. Through the rain-streaked windows, I could see maybe half a dozen people inside, probably stranded travelers like ourselves. I need to make a call, Carlos said, and we should probably get some coffee. This might take a while. Inside the diner, Carlos immediately went to a corner booth and pulled out his phone. I could see him talking intently to someone, occasionally glancing in my direction. The conversation went on for 20 minutes, and I watched my brother's body language grow more and more agitated. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a hurricane tracking map spread out behind the counter, poured me coffee without being asked. Y'all evacuating? She asked. We're supposed to be, I said, but my brother has some business to finish first. She looked over at Carlos, who was now gesturing emphatically while talking into his phone. Honey, I've lived through 15 hurricanes in my 40 years on the coast. Ain't no business worth dying for. When Carlos finally ended his call and came back to the counter, he looked like a man who had just received a death sentence. We need to go back to Galveston, he said. I stared at him in disbelief. Galveston is about to be underwater, Carlos. The storm surge forecast is 15 feet. Our neighborhood is going to flood. I know, he said quietly, but I don't have a choice. Of course you have a choice. We get in the truck right now and drive to San Antonio. Whatever business you have can wait until after the hurricane. Carlos shook his head. No, it can't. Jess, there are some things you don't understand. Some people you don't want to disappoint. More dangerous than a Category 4 hurricane. He looked at me then with an expression I'd never seen before. Complete despair mixed with something that might have been guilt. Maybe, he said simply. The drive back to Galveston was terrifying. We were now driving directly into the teeth of Hurricane Petra, fighting winds that were easily over hurricane force. Carlos had to stop twice to clear debris from the roadway, and several times I thought the truck might actually blow over. The rain was so heavy that the wipers couldn't keep up, and we were essentially driving blind through the worst storm either of us had ever experienced. By the time we reached the Causeway Bridge, leading back onto Galveston Island, conditions were almost impassable. The bridge was supposed to be closed to traffic, but somehow Carlos talked our way past the police barricade by claiming we were emergency personnel returning to duty. That was a lie, I said as we crossed the bridge, watching the Gulf waters churning violently below us. Everything's a lie now, Carlos replied cryptically. Our neighborhood was unrecognizable. Avenue O was already flooding, with water Reaching the first step of most houses, palm trees that had stood for decades were bent nearly horizontal by the wind, and debris was flying through the air like missiles. We had to park 2 blocks away from our duplex because the street was impassable. "Why are we here, Carlos?" I shouted over the howling wind as we struggled toward our house. What was so important that we had to come back into this? Carlos didn't answer until we reached our front porch, which was now partially underwater. Then he turned to me with that same desperate expression I'd been seeing all day. "I'm sorry, Jess," he said. "I'm so sorry for what I'm about to do." "What are you talking about?" He pulled out his phone and made one last call. I could barely hear him over the storm, but I caught fragments. "She's here and I kept my end of the bargain, and Wednesday morning after it's over." When he hung up, he looked at me with tears mixing with the rain on his face. "Carlos, you're scaring me," I said. "What's going on?" "The people I owe money to, they wanted collateral," he said. "Something to guarantee I wouldn't just disappear." A cold realization was starting to form in my mind. "What kind of collateral?" "The deed to the house was part of it," he said. "But that wasn't enough. They needed something more personal. Something that would ensure I'd come back and pay what I owe." I stared at him as the pieces fell into place. The envelope he'd left at the motel, the phone calls, the insistence on coming back to Galveston despite the hurricane. "You used me as collateral," I said, my voice barely audible over the storm. Carlos couldn't meet my eyes. "They know where you work, where you live, where Dad is in the nursing home. If I don't pay them back, they'll come after you first. And the only way I can pay them back is if I survive this storm and get access to the insurance money when the house floods." The full scope of his betrayal hit me like a physical blow. "You brought me back here to die." "No," he said desperately. "The house is solid, it's survived storms before. You'll be safe on the second floor until the water recedes. I just need you to stay here while I figure out how to get their money." "Where are you going?" I asked, though I already knew. "Back to Houston. I have other assets to liquidate, other options to explore. But I needed you safe and accounted for, where they could find you if necessary." Carlos was already backing away from the house toward where he'd left the truck. The water on our street was rising rapidly now, and waves were starting to crash over the seawall just 3 blocks away. "Don't leave me here," I called after him. "Carlos, please. We can figure this out together." But he was already running through the knee-deep water toward his truck, leaving me alone on the porch of our flooding house while the storm of the century raged around me. The last thing I heard before he drove away was the sound of his engine fading into the howling wind. I stood there in shock for several minutes, water swirling around my legs, trying to process what had just happened. My brother, the person I'd trusted more than anyone in the world, had just used me as human collateral in a debt arrangement with dangerous people. He'd brought me back into the path of a killer hurricane not to keep me safe, but to keep me available to his creditors. The water was rising fast now, already up to the first step of our porch. I could hear windows breaking in houses down the street and the sound of metal roofing being torn away by the wind. Hurricane Petra was making landfall, and I was trapped in the flooding zone with no way out and no one coming to help me. That's when I remembered the emergency contact form I'd filled out at the college library. The one where I'd listed the Red Cross as our family's emergency contact back when Mom had volunteered with them and we'd participated in their disaster preparedness workshops. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, knowing the lines would be overwhelmed, but hoping someone, somewhere, might hear my call for help. The call went straight to a busy signal. I tried the non-emergency line for the police department, then the fire department, then the Coast Guard. Nothing was getting through. The water reached the porch and started seeping under our front door. I was going to have to get to the second floor and hope the house structure could withstand the storm surge that was still building offshore. But first, I had one more number to try. I found the Red Cross emergency hotline in my phone's contacts and dialed, expecting another busy signal or recording. Instead, after 3 rings, a calm voice answered. American Red Cross Emergency Response. This is Margaret Thompson. My name is Jessica Martinez, I said, shouting to be heard over the storm. I'm trapped in a flooding house on Galveston Island during Hurricane Petra. My brother abandoned me here, and I need help. Jessica, I need you to stay calm and give me your exact address, the voice said. We're going to get you out of there. Part 4. The Abandonment Event. The water reached my waist before Margaret Thompson's voice came back through my phone with coordinates and instructions that sounded impossibly calm given the chaos around me. Hurricane Petra was now a full-blown Category 4 monster making landfall just east of our location, and our duplex was taking a beating that would have been terrifying under normal circumstances. With the rising storm surge, it was becoming a death trap. Jessica, I need you to get to the highest point in your house immediately, Margaret said through the static-filled connection. Do you have access to an attic or second floor? Second floor, I managed climbing the stairs while holding my phone above my head. Water was already pouring through the front door and spreading across our first floor with frightening speed. Good, can you get to a window that faces away from the storm direction? I made it to my old bedroom, which faced north toward the mainland. Through the window, I could see that our entire neighborhood was now submerged under several feet of rushing water. Cars were floating down Avenue O like toys in a bathtub, and I could see pieces of houses, siding, porch railings, entire sections of roof, spinning past in the current. I'm upstairs, I told Margaret, trying to keep my voice steady, but the water's still rising. How long until you can get here? There was a pause that lasted too long. Jessica, I need to be honest with you. Emergency response vehicles can't operate in these conditions. The winds are sustained over 140 miles per hour, and the storm surge is exceeding all predictions. We won't be able to reach you until the storm passes. The reality of my situation hit me fully for the first time. Carlos had left me to die. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, trapped in our family home, while Hurricane Petra tore it apart around me. The water was now halfway up the staircase, and I could hear the ominous creaking of wooden support beams stressed beyond their limits. How long until it passes? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. The eye wall should pass over your location in about 4 hours, Margaret said. But the dangerous conditions will persist for at least 8 to 10 hours total. 8 to 10 hours. I looked around my childhood bedroom, trying to calculate how long the second floor could remain above water if the storm surge continued rising. The forecast had called for 15-foot surge, and our house sat on a foundation that was maybe 8 feet above sea level. The math was not encouraging. Jessica, I need you to tell me everything about your situation, Margaret continued. How did you end up trapped there? Where is your family? So I told her about Carlos's gambling debts and desperate phone calls, about the mysterious meeting at the motel and the envelope he'd left behind, about his confession that he'd used me as collateral with dangerous people, and his decision to abandon me in the path of the hurricane while he fled to safety inland. Margaret listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Her voice remained calm and professional throughout, but I could hear something changing in her tone as I described my brother's betrayal. Jessica, I want you to understand something, she said when I finished. What your brother did isn't just abandonment, it's attempted murder. He deliberately placed you in a life-threatening situation to protect himself from the consequences of his own choices. Hearing it stated so bluntly made the full horror of Carlos's actions sink in. I started crying then, not just from fear of the hurricane, but from the devastating realization that the person I'd loved and trusted most in the world had been willing to sacrifice my life to save his own. Why would he do this to me? I asked through my tears. We were supposed to take care of each other. That's what we promised Mom before she died. People make terrible decisions when they're desperate, Margaret said gently. But that doesn't excuse what he's done to you. Right now, though, we need to focus on keeping you alive until we can get you out of there." The house shuddered violently as something large, maybe a neighbor's garage or a piece of the seawall, slammed into our foundation. The lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness except for the eerie green glow from my phone screen. "The power's out," I reported. "That's normal for this type of storm," Margaret said. "Jessica, I need you to find the safest, most structurally sound part of your house. Usually that's an interior closet or bathroom without windows." I felt my way to the hallway bathroom, a small windowless room in the center of the second floor. I could hear water rushing below me now, along with the sound of furniture being tossed around as the first floor filled completely. "I'm in the bathroom," I said. "Good. Now I need you to gather anything that might help you survive. Water, food, warm clothes, a flashlight if you have one. And Jessica, I need you to keep talking to me. Don't hang up this phone unless you absolutely have to." I managed to find a flashlight in the linen closet, along with some towels and a first aid kit. From my bedroom, I grabbed a jacket and the energy bars I always kept in my desk drawer for late-night study sessions. It wasn't much, but it might keep me alive until rescue arrived. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" I said, settling into the bathroom with my supplies arranged around me. "Of course. Why are you doing this? Staying on the phone with me, I mean. Don't you have other emergencies to handle?" There was a pause before she answered. "Jessica, 20 years ago I was a newly trained Red Cross volunteer when Hurricane Alicia hit. I took a call from a teenage girl who was trapped in her flooded house after her stepfather left her behind during the evacuation. I stayed on the phone with her for 12 hours until we could get her out. What happened to her? She survived, and she grew up to become an emergency management specialist who saved hundreds of lives in disasters across the country. Sometimes the person you help in their darkest moment becomes someone who helps others in theirs." The house shook again, and I heard the unmistakable sound of breaking glass somewhere below me. The storm was literally tearing our duplex apart piece by piece. "Margaret, I'm scared," I admitted. "Being scared is smart," she said. "Fear keeps you alert and focused. But Jessica, I want you to remember something. You're not just a victim of your brother's choices. You're a survivor who's going to get through this and build a better life on the other side." For the next 6 hours, Margaret Thompson stayed on the phone with me while Hurricane Petra tried its best to kill me. She talked me through the terrifying moments when the storm surge reached its peak and water started seeping up through the second floor. She helped me stay calm when the winds reached their maximum intensity and it sounded like a freight train was parked on our roof. She shared stories about other survivors she'd helped over the years, people who'd faced impossible odds and found ways to overcome them. Most importantly, she helped me understand that Carlos's betrayal, while devastating, didn't define my worth or determine my future. She talked about resilience and recovery, about how some of the strongest people she'd known had been forged in circumstances that would have destroyed others. "Your brother made a choice that reveals his character," she said, during a brief lull in the storm. "But how you respond to that choice will reveal yours." As the hurricane's eye wall finally passed over us and the winds began to diminish, Margaret started coordinating my rescue. She'd been in contact with emergency response teams throughout the night, and as soon as conditions allowed, they'd be coming for me. "Jessica, I can see the first rescue boats launching from the mainland," she said, as dawn broke over the devastated landscape. "You're going to be out of there within the hour." I looked out through the bathroom door toward the window in my old bedroom. The water was slowly receding, leaving behind a neighborhood that looked like it had been hit by a bomb. Houses were reduced to foundations, cars were stacked on top of each other like discarded toys, and debris covered everything as far as I could see. But I was alive. Against all odds, despite my brother's attempt to sacrifice me for his own survival, I was alive. When the rescue boat finally reached our house, the first person to climb through the second-floor window was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the most compassionate eyes I'd ever seen. She was wearing a Red Cross jacket and a headset, and she moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. Jessica Martinez, she asked. Yes, I said, hardly believing this moment was real. I'm Margaret Thompson, she said, reaching out to help me stand. Let's get you out of here. Part 5. The breaking point. The rescue boat carried me away from the remains of our duplex and through a neighborhood that no longer existed. What had been Avenue O was now a debris field of splintered wood, twisted metal, and personal belongings scattered like confetti across the water. I recognized pieces of our neighbors' lives, floating past Mrs. Chen's garden gnomes, the Johnsons' porch swing, fragments of the life I'd known for 24 years. Margaret sat beside me in the boat, her hand on my shoulder as we navigated through the destruction. She hadn't said much since pulling me from the house, but her presence was steadying in a way I couldn't fully explain. After spending the night, listening to her voice through my phone, having her physically there felt like being rescued by a guardian angel. Where are we going? I asked as we approached what used to be the seawall. Mainland Evacuation Center, she said. We need to get you medical attention first, then we'll figure out next steps. The evacuation center was set up in a high school gymnasium about 20 miles inland. Hundreds of people filled the space, families with children, elderly couples, single adults like me who'd lost everything to Petra's fury. The Red Cross had transformed the gym into an efficient operation with medical stations, food service, temporary sleeping areas, and communication centers where survivors could contact family members. Margaret walked me to the medical station first, where a doctor checked me over for injuries and signs of hypothermia. Other than some cuts on my hands from broken glass and exhaustion from the ordeal, I was physically unharmed. Emotionally was another story entirely. Jessica, I know this is overwhelming, Margaret said, as we sat at a folding table with coffee and sandwiches that tasted better than any meal I'd ever had. But I need to ask you some questions about your brother's situation. I told her everything I could remember about Carlos's phone calls, his mysterious meetings, the envelope he'd left at the motel. Margaret took notes on a small pad, her expression growing more serious as I provided details about the people he owed money to and their threats about collateral. These sound like organized crime connections, she said when I finished. The fact that they were willing to accept a person as collateral suggests they're not typical loan sharks. This could be trafficking related. The word trafficking sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. You mean they were going to? I don't know for certain, Margaret said, but we need to assume you're still in danger. These people think your brother owes them money, and they think you're leverage they can use against him. Over the next few days, as the scope of Hurricane Petra's destruction became clear, I learned just how completely my old life had been erased. Our duplex was a total loss, not just flooded, but literally swept off its foundation. The college where I worked had suffered severe damage and wouldn't reopen for months. Most devastatingly, Sunset Manor, where Dad was living, had been evacuated before the storm, but in the chaos of relocating residents, he'd suffered a massive stroke and died at the temporary facility. Carlos hadn't contacted me once since abandoning me to the hurricane. Not to check if I was alive, not to ask about Dad, not even to explain or apologize for what he'd done. According to the police detective who interviewed me about the circumstances of my rescue, Carlos had never shown up at our cousin Maria's house in San Antonio. He'd simply vanished, leaving behind debts that someone apparently expected me to help pay. We've had inquiries, Detective Morrison told me during our second meeting. People claiming your brother used family assets as collateral for his debts. They want to know where you are and when you'll be available to discuss arrangements. Margaret was present for this conversation, and I could see her jaw tighten as the detective explained the situation. After he left, she sat across from me at the folding table and spoke in a voice that was both gentle and absolutely firm. Jessica, you can't go back to your old life, she said. Even if there was anything left to go back to, which there isn't. These people your brother got involved with, they're not going to just forget about you because he disappeared. In their minds, you represent $85,000 plus interest, and they're going to keep coming until they collect. The evacuation center had become a temporary home for hundreds of displaced families, but most of them had relatives or friends they could stay with while rebuilding their lives. I had no one. Maria, our cousin in San Antonio, had made it clear during a brief phone call that she couldn't take me in, not with Carlos's creditors potentially tracking family members. Dad's few remaining relatives lived too far away and barely knew me. Carlos had been my entire family support system, and he destroyed that, along with everything else, when he drove away through the hurricane. Margaret had arranged for me to stay in a FEMA trailer temporarily, but even that felt dangerous. The trailer park where it was located was barely 20 miles from Galveston, close enough that anyone looking for me could find me easily. Every night, I lay awake listening for footsteps outside, waiting for a knock on the door that might be Carlos's creditors coming to collect their human collateral. During the day, I helped with Red Cross relief efforts at the evacuation center. It gave me purpose and kept my mind occupied, but it also made me visible to anyone who might be watching for me. Margaret had assigned me to work with supply distribution, organizing donations, and helping other survivors navigate the maze of disaster assistance programs. The work was meaningful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living on borrowed time. 3 weeks after the hurricane, my worst fears materialized. I was sorting through donated clothes when a woman approached me at the volunteer table. She looked normal enough, middle-aged, professionally dressed, with a clipboard and badge, that identified her as being from some kind of social services organization. "Jessica Martinez?" she asked with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "I'm Linda Walsh, from Gulf Coast Family Services. I understand you've experienced some significant losses due to Hurricane Petra. I'd like to discuss some assistance programs that might help you get back on your feet." Something about her felt wrong immediately. Her badge looked legitimate, but her questions were too specific, too focused on my current living situation, and whether I had family members who might be able to help with financial obligations. When she asked if I'd heard from my brother recently, I knew she wasn't really from social services. "I'm sorry, but I need to check with my supervisor before discussing my case with outside agencies," I said, backing away from the table. Her friendly demeanor slipped slightly. "Of course. But Jessica, it's important that we connect soon. There are time-sensitive matters that need to be resolved." I found Margaret immediately, and described the encounter. Her face went pale, as I repeated the woman's questions word for word. "Pack your things," she said, without hesitation. "You're leaving tonight. Where am I going?" "Somewhere safe," Margaret said. "Jessica, I've been making some calls over the past few weeks, reaching out to contacts in emergency management programs around the state. There's a position available in San Antonio, working with disaster response coordination. It comes with housing, a new identity, and most importantly, distance from anyone looking for the old Jessica Martinez. The idea of disappearing, of essentially dying, and being reborn as someone else, should have been terrifying. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the hurricane. New hope. Margaret was offering me not just escape from Carlos's mess, but an opportunity to build something meaningful from the wreckage of my old life. "What about my EMT certification, my college transcripts, everything that proves who I am?" "We'll handle the paperwork," Margaret said. "The Red Cross has programs for survivors who need to relocate for safety reasons. Your educational records can be transferred under seal, and your EMT certification can be verified through official channels. You'll still be Jessica Martinez on paper, but Jessica Martinez, who happens to live in San Antonio instead of Galveston." That night, Margaret drove me to San Antonio herself. We left the FEMA trailer park at 2 a.m., taking back roads and avoiding highways where we might be easily tracked. During the 3-hour drive, she explained what she was offering me. "The University of Texas at San Antonio has a graduate program in emergency management," she said. "Full scholarship available for disaster survivors who want to work in the field. The coursework builds on your EMT training and adds components in disaster psychology, emergency planning, interagency coordination, and crisis communication. Why would they offer a scholarship to someone they don't know? Margaret glanced at me with a slight smile. They know me. I've been working in emergency management for 25 years, and I've recommended students for this program before. Students who've lived through disasters have insights that can't be taught from textbooks. She pulled into the parking lot of a modest apartment complex on the northwest side of San Antonio.
Oh!
The buildings were newer, well-maintained, with good lighting and security gates. The kind of place where someone could disappear into the crowd of graduate students and young professionals. Apartment 247, she said, handing me a set of keys. 1 bedroom, furnished, utilities included. The lease is paid for the first year through a Red Cross assistance grant. After that, you'll be earning enough through your graduate assistantship to cover it yourself. The apartment was small but comfortable, with a view of a courtyard, where other residents walked their dogs and children played on playground equipment. It felt safe in a way I hadn't experienced since before Hurricane Petra. More importantly, it felt like a place where I could start over. Margaret, why are you doing all this for me? I asked as she helped me carry in the few belongings I'd accumulated since the hurricane. She sat on the couch and was quiet for a long time before answering. 20 years ago, I took that phone call from a girl trapped in a flooding house, but before that night, I'd never really understood what it meant to save someone's life. I'd helped with evacuations, distributed supplies, coordinated shelter operations, all important work, but staying on the phone with that girl, talking her through the worst night of her life, that changed me. You mentioned she became an emergency management specialist. Dr. Sarah Chen, she runs disaster response programs across 3 states now, but more than that, she's saved hundreds of lives because someone saved hers first. There's a ripple effect to rescue, Jessica. When you save one person, you're potentially saving all the people they'll go on to help. Margaret left me with enough groceries for a week, contact information for my new academic advisor, and a cell phone with a San Antonio number. She also left me with something more valuable than any of those practical items. The first sense of real possibility I'd felt since Carlos drove away into Hurricane Petra. The next morning, I walked across the UTSA campus to meet Dr. Williams, the director of the emergency management program. The meeting felt like a job interview, except instead of trying to impress him with my qualifications, I found myself telling him the truth about surviving the hurricane and what I'd learned about human behavior under extreme stress. You've experienced disaster from the victim's perspective, he said, after I finished describing that night in the bathroom, talking to Margaret on the phone while the hurricane tried to kill me. That gives you insights into crisis psychology that most of our students have to learn theoretically. Dr. Williams explained that the program combined traditional academic coursework with hands-on experience working with actual emergency response agencies. Students spent their first year in classrooms learning about disaster theory, emergency planning, and interagency coordination. The second year involved internships with organizations like FEMA, the Red Cross, state emergency management divisions, and local fire and police departments. Margaret Thompson speaks very highly of your potential, he said. She's recommended several students to our program over the years, and every one of them has gone on to distinguished careers in emergency management. Her judgment carries a lot of weight here. I started classes 2 weeks later, diving into coursework that felt both academically challenging and deeply personal. Learning about disaster psychology helped me understand my own trauma and recovery process. Studying emergency planning gave me frameworks for the kind of systematic thinking I'd always been good at, but never had formal training in. Most importantly, the program connected me with other students who'd chosen emergency management because they wanted to help people during the worst moments of their lives. My classmates came from diverse backgrounds: former military personnel, firefighters looking to advance their careers, social workers who specialized in crisis intervention, recent college graduates drawn to public service.
What we shared was a common understanding that disasters reveal both the worst and best in people, and that good
Emergency management can make the difference between tragedy and recovery. The coursework was intensive, but fascinating. We studied case studies of major disasters, Hurricane Katrina, the 9/11 attacks, the Joplin tornado, the Camp Fire in California. We learned about the stages of disaster response, from immediate rescue operations through long-term recovery and rebuilding. We analyzed what worked and what failed in each case, identifying patterns and developing frameworks for improved response. But the most valuable part of the program was the psychological component. Dr. Martinez, our crisis psychology instructor, helped us understand how people react under extreme stress, why some individuals become heroes while others abandon their responsibilities, and how trauma affects decision-making and recovery. Disaster doesn't create character, she explained during one particularly relevant lecture. It reveals character. The person who abandons family during an evacuation was always capable of that abandonment. The person who risks their life to save strangers was always capable of that heroism. Crisis simply strips away the social conventions that usually hide our true nature. I thought about Carlos often during these discussions. Had he always been capable of sacrificing me to save himself? Had I simply been too trusting to see that side of him? Or had his desperation truly transformed him into someone unrecognizable? Dr. Martinez's lectures suggested that desperation didn't create new character traits. It just revealed which traits were strongest when everything else was stripped away. My academic performance exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. The combination of practical experience and genuine passion for the subject matter made me one of the top students in my cohort. Dr. Williams started assigning me additional responsibilities, helping with research projects, guest lecturing in undergraduate courses, representing the program at academic conferences. But the real transformation was happening outside the classroom. For the first time in my adult life, I was building an identity that wasn't defined by my relationship to Carlos or my role as a caretaker in our family. I was Jessica Martinez, emergency management student and future disaster response professional. I was someone who had survived the worst and was using that experience to help others do the same. Margaret stayed in regular contact throughout my first year, calling every few weeks to check on my progress and occasionally visiting San Antonio for work-related conferences. During one such visit, she shared an update that both relieved and unsettled me. Carlos surfaced briefly in Nevada about 6 months ago, she said over coffee near campus. He was arrested for credit card fraud, but made bail and disappeared again before trial. The people he owed money to seem to have given up actively looking for you, but Detective Morrison advises continued caution. Do you think he'll ever try to contact me? Margaret considered this carefully. People like Carlos don't usually reach out unless they need something. He abandoned you to save himself once. If he contacts you again, it will be because he needs you to save him again. This conversation reinforced my decision to keep my location private and maintain minimal online presence. I'd learned to live without social media, to pay for things with cash when possible, to be aware of my surroundings and have exit strategies for different situations. It was a hyper-vigilant way of living, but it allowed me to focus on rebuilding without constantly looking over my shoulder. As my first year of graduate school concluded, I realized that Margaret had given me something far more valuable than rescue from immediate danger. She'd given me a future worth protecting, work that felt meaningful, and the tools to help other people survive their own disasters. The girl who'd been trapped in a flooding house, abandoned by her brother and left for dead, had become someone who could prevent other people from experiencing that same abandonment. Part 7. The unexpected savior Margaret Thompson officially became my mentor during the summer between my first and second year of graduate school. The arrangement was formalized through the university's professional mentorship program, but our relationship had evolved far beyond the typical faculty-student dynamic. She'd become the steady, reliable presence that Carlos had never actually been, even when I'd believed he was protecting me. The summer internship she arranged for me was with the Texas Division of Emergency Management in Austin. It was prestigious placement that graduate students usually didn't get until their final semester, but Margaret's recommendation opened doors that would have remained closed otherwise. The work involved real disaster response coordination, not just academic exercises, and I found myself deploying to actual emergencies across the state. My first major deployment was to East Texas for severe flooding along the Sabine River. 3 counties were affected, with hundreds of families evacuated and significant infrastructure damage. I worked with the State Emergency Operations Center, coordinating resources between local agencies and federal disaster response teams. The experience was simultaneously overwhelming and energizing, finally putting my training to use in real situations where decisions had immediate, life or death consequences. Margaret joined the deployment as a senior Red Cross coordinator, and I got to see her in action during an actual disaster. Her competence was remarkable. She could assess complex situations quickly, identify resource gaps and coordination problems, and communicate with everyone from local mayors to federal agency directors with equal effectiveness. But what impressed me most was her ability to remain calm and focused while managing multiple crises simultaneously. The key to emergency management, she told me during a brief break between coordination meetings, is understanding that you can't save everyone, but you can save someone. And sometimes that someone you save goes on to save others. During the Sabine River deployment, I handled my first major family crisis as a professional rather than a victim. A mother called our emergency operations center, frantic because her teenage son was missing after their house flooded. Local search and rescue teams were overwhelmed with higher priority calls, and the family was getting increasingly desperate. I coordinated with multiple agencies to organize a targeted search operation, using GPS data from the boy's cell phone and local knowledge about flood patterns to identify the most likely areas where he might have taken shelter. We found him 6 hours later, trapped but uninjured in the second floor of a neighbor's house, much like I'd been trapped during Hurricane Petra. When I helped carry that boy to safety and reunited him with his mother, I understood viscerally what Margaret had meant about the ripple effects of rescue. The skills I'd learned because Carlos abandoned me were now being used to prevent other families from experiencing that same loss. My trauma had been transformed into purpose. "You're a natural at this work," Margaret told me as we debriefed from the deployment. "You have the technical skills, but more importantly, you have the emotional intelligence to understand what disaster victims are experiencing. That combination is rare." Back in San Antonio for my second year of coursework, I started specializing in disaster psychology and family crisis intervention. My academic advisor, Dr. Williams, encouraged me to develop research interests around trauma recovery and post-disaster resilience. The topic felt personally relevant, obviously, but approaching it from an academic perspective helped me understand my own experience in broader context. I began working on a thesis project examining factors that contribute to post-disaster recovery success. The research involved interviewing disaster survivors from multiple events: hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, floods, to identify patterns in how people rebuild their lives after losing everything. The interviews were difficult but enlightening, revealing common themes around the importance of social support, meaningful work, and forward-focused thinking. One interview particularly struck me. An elderly man named Robert had survived Hurricane Harvey in Houston, losing his house and most of his possessions to flooding. But unlike many disaster victims who struggled with depression and anxiety for years afterward, Robert had bounced back quickly and was now volunteering with multiple disaster relief organizations. "The storm took my stuff," he told me, "but it also showed me what really mattered. My wife and kids were safe, we had our health,
Everything else was just things that could be replaced. More importantly, going through that experience made me want to help other people going through the same thing. Robert's perspective reminded me of something Margaret had said during one of our mentoring sessions. Disaster can be destructive, but it can also be clarifying. Sometimes losing everything you thought you needed helps you discover what you actually need. As I progressed through my graduate program, Margaret began including me in higher-level emergency management activities. She recommended me for training programs, typically reserved for more experienced professionals, arranged for me to attend national conferences where I could network with emergency management leaders from across the country, and even invited me to co-author research papers on disaster response coordination. "You're not just my protege," she explained during one of our regular mentoring meetings. "You're my successor. I won't be doing this work forever, and the field needs people like you, people who understand both the technical and human sides of emergency management." Margaret was in her mid-50s, with over 25 years of experience in disaster response. She'd worked every major disaster in Texas during that time, from Hurricane Alicia in 1983 through Hurricane Harvey in 2017. Her expertise was recognized nationally, and she was frequently called in to advise on disasters outside Texas as well. But more than her professional accomplishments, what made Margaret special was her genuine care for disaster victims. She remembered names and follow-up stories years later. She kept in touch with families she'd helped, celebrating their recoveries and supporting them through setbacks. She understood that disaster response wasn't just about immediate rescue operations, it was about helping people rebuild their lives in sustainable ways. During my second year, Margaret started talking about succession planning and long-term career development. She'd been offered a position with FEMA headquarters in Washington, D.C., a significant promotion that would put her in charge of coordinating federal disaster response across multiple states. It was an opportunity she'd worked toward for decades, but accepting it would mean leaving Texas and the regional work she'd built her career around. "I want you to apply for my current position when I move to D.C., she told me over dinner at her favorite restaurant near campus. "You'll need a few more years of experience first, but the Red Cross regional coordinator job would be perfect preparation for eventually running emergency management at the state level." The conversation was both exciting and terrifying. Margaret was essentially offering to fast-track my career into positions of significant responsibility, but she was also suggesting a timeline that would put me in leadership roles while I was still in my 20s, managing experienced professionals who might question my qualifications. "I don't know if I'm ready for that level of responsibility," I admitted. "Nobody feels ready," Margaret said. "I certainly didn't when I was promoted to my first management position. But readiness isn't about feeling confident, it's about having the right combination of skills, judgment, and commitment. You have all three." Margaret's confidence in my abilities was both reassuring and challenging. She saw potential in me that I wasn't sure I saw in myself, but her track record of identifying and developing talent was impressive. Several people she'd mentored over the years had gone on to prominent positions in emergency management, and her judgment was respected throughout the field. As my graduate program neared completion, Margaret arranged for my final internship to be with her directly, working as her assistant coordinator on Red Cross operations across South Texas. It was essentially an apprenticeship, giving me hands-on experience with every aspect of regional emergency management while learning from someone who'd mastered the field. The internship included responsibility for real operations with real consequences. I managed supply distribution for tornado recovery in Moore County, coordinated volunteer deployment for wildfire response in the Hill Country, and developed evacuation plans for coastal communities, preparing for hurricane season. Each assignment built on the previous one, gradually increasing my responsibilities and decision-making authority. "You're ready," Margaret told me as my internship concluded. "More ready than I was when I started doing this work full-time. You have the academic foundation I never had, plus practical experience with actual disasters. Most importantly, You have the right motivation. You're doing this because you want to help people, not because you want authority or recognition. Margaret's mentorship had transformed me from a hurricane victim with no clear future into an emergency management professional with specialized expertise and clear career trajectory. But beyond the professional development, she'd given me something Carlos never had: unconditional support without hidden agendas. When Margaret invested in my success, it was because she genuinely believed in my potential, not because she needed something from me in return. The day I graduated with my master's degree in emergency management, Margaret was in the audience along with Dr. Williams and several of my classmates' families. After the ceremony, she pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Jessica, I need to tell you something I've never shared before," she said. "That girl I told you about, the one I stayed on the phone with during Hurricane Alicia, she wasn't some abstract example I use for inspiration. She was my daughter." I stared at her in shock. In all our conversations about that rescue, Margaret had never indicated any personal connection to the victim. "Your daughter?" "My stepdaughter, technically. Sarah was 16 when her biological father left her in a flooding house during the evacuation, just like Carlos left you. I was a Red Cross volunteer then, new to the work, and when the call came in, I happened to be the one who answered." Margaret's eyes were bright with unshed tears as she continued. "Saving Sarah that night didn't just change her life, it changed mine. I realized that emergency management wasn't just a job for me, it was a calling. And when I got the call from you during Hurricane Petra, it felt like history repeating itself. Another girl abandoned by family, trapped in a flood, needing someone to care enough to stay on the phone. Is that why you've done so much for me? Because I reminded you of Sarah?" Margaret shook her head. "I've done so much for you because you deserve it, because you have the potential to help hundreds of people throughout your career." Sarah went on to become a physician specializing in disaster medicine. "She's saved countless lives. You're going to save even more." This revelation recontextualized everything about Margaret's investment in my development. She wasn't just a mentor who'd taken a professional interest in my potential, she was someone who understood personally what family abandonment during disaster felt like, and who'd built her entire career around preventing that abandonment from defining victims' futures. "Thank you," I said, knowing the words were completely inadequate, "for everything. Thank me by using what you've learned to help others," Margaret replied. "And remember, family isn't defined by blood relationships or legal documents, it's defined by who shows up when you need them most." As I stood in my graduation gown, holding my master's degree and looking toward a career in emergency management, I realized that Margaret had given me something far more valuable than professional opportunities or career advancement. She'd given me a new understanding of what family could be, not people who shared my DNA or my childhood home, but people who chose to invest in my success without expecting anything in return. The girl who'd been abandoned during Hurricane Petra had died in that flooding duplex. The woman who emerged from Margaret's mentorship was someone entirely new, someone with purpose, skills, and most importantly, the support system to use those skills effectively. Carlos had tried to sacrifice me to save himself, but Margaret had saved me in order to help me save others. Part 8: Learning and Adaptation. My first full-time position in emergency management came through Margaret's network of contacts across Texas. Dr. Rebecca Santos, the Director of Emergency Services for Bexar County, had worked with Margaret on several major disasters and trusted her recommendations completely. When a coordinator position opened up in San Antonio, Margaret recommended me before the job was even posted publicly. Jessica Martinez has the best combination of academic training and practical experience I've seen in a new graduate, Margaret told Dr. Santos during their phone conversation, which I learned about later. More importantly, she has the psychological resilience and emotional intelligence to handle crisis situations without burning out. The position was perfect for someone starting their career in emergency management. I would coordinate disaster preparedness activities for the county, work with local municipalities to develop and update emergency plans, and serve as a liaison between local agencies and state-level emergency management during actual disasters. It was significant responsibility, but with the kind of oversight and support structure that would allow me to learn while making meaningful contributions. Dr. Santos turned out to be another remarkable mentor, though her approach was completely different from Margaret's nurturing style. Dr. Santos was demanding, detail-oriented, and had zero tolerance for anything less than excellence. She'd built her career in emergency management during an era when women had to be twice as competent as men to get half the recognition, and she expected the same level of professional excellence from everyone who worked for her. Emergency management is not a field where you can learn from mistakes, she told me during my first week on the job. When we make mistakes, people die, so we don't make mistakes. We prepare thoroughly, we execute precisely, and we learn continuously, so that our next response is even better than our last one. My first major project was updating emergency evacuation plans for the county's flood-prone area. Texas had experienced several major flooding events in recent years: Hurricane Harvey, the Memorial Day floods in San Antonio, flash flooding along the Guadalupe River, and each disaster had revealed weaknesses in existing evacuation procedures. My job was to analyze what had gone wrong in previous events and develop improved protocols that would save more lives in future disasters. The work required extensive collaboration with local fire departments, police agencies, medical services, and community organizations. I spent weeks interviewing emergency responders, reviewing after-action reports from previous disasters, and studying population data to identify vulnerable communities that might need special evacuation assistance. What I discovered was sobering. Many of the evacuation failures in previous disasters had resulted from poor communication between agencies, inadequate transportation resources for elderly or disabled residents, and insufficient public education about evacuation procedures. People had died not because the disasters were unpredictable, but because the systems designed to protect them had failed. This is why the work matters, Dr. Santos said as we reviewed my preliminary findings. Every protocol we improve, every communication gap we close, every resource shortage we address, all of that translates into lives saved during the next disaster. Working on evacuation planning also gave me deeper insight into the kind of abandonment I'd experienced during Hurricane Petra. Carlos's decision to leave me behind wasn't just personal betrayal, it represented a complete failure of the most basic emergency management principle, which is that you never leave anyone behind who can't evacuate themselves. Dr. Santos encouraged me to use my personal experience with Hurricane Petra as a case study in evacuation failure, but to analyze it objectively, rather than emotionally. Your brother's decision to abandon you represents multiple system failures, she pointed out: family emergency planning failure, communication breakdown, inadequate official evacuation assistance, and ultimately, individual moral failure. Understanding how those failures compounded can help us prevent similar situations for other families. This analytical approach to my own trauma was initially difficult, but ultimately therapeutic. Instead of viewing Carlos's abandonment as a personal rejection, I began understanding it as a preventable system failure. If better emergency planning protocols had been in place, if evacuation assistance had been more readily available, if family emergency planning education had been more effective, Carlos might not have felt that abandoning me was his only option for survival. My work on evacuation planning caught the attention of state-level emergency management officials, and within 6 months, I was invited to join a statewide committee developing improved hurricane evacuation procedures for the entire Texas coast. The committee included representatives from FEMA, the National Weather Service, state emergency management, and local agencies from every coastal county. Serving on the committee was both professionally exciting and personally challenging. The meetings were held in different coastal cities, including several trips to Galveston, where I had to confront the physical remains of my old life. The duplex where I'd been trapped during Hurricane Petra had never been rebuilt. The lot sat empty, except for the concrete foundation, now cracked and partially covered with weeds. During one committee meeting in Galveston, I drove past the lot during a lunch break. Seeing the empty space where our family home had stood brought back all the emotions from that night: the terror of rising water, the betrayal when Carlos drove away, the desperate phone call to Margaret, the long hours wondering if I would survive until rescue arrived. But standing there, I also felt something I hadn't expected: gratitude. Not gratitude for the trauma, but gratitude for what had emerged from it. The person I'd become, the career I'd built, the relationships I'd formed, the skills I'd developed. None of that would have existed if Carlos hadn't abandoned me and Margaret hadn't rescued me. "You look different," Dr. Santos observed when I returned from that lunch break. "More settled somehow." "I think I just made peace with something," I replied. "Good. That kind of emotional resolution will make you a better emergency manager. You can't help other people recover from trauma if you haven't processed your own." My work on the statewide committee led to invitations to present at national emergency management conferences, where I shared research on evacuation planning and disaster psychology. The presentations were well received, and I began building a national reputation as someone who combined strong technical skills with deep understanding of the human factors in emergency management. Margaret attended one of these presentations at a conference in Denver, beaming with pride as I discussed evacuation protocol improvements that could save thousands of lives during the next major hurricane. After my presentation, she introduced me to colleagues from across the country, each introduction reinforcing her confidence in my potential. "Jessica is going to be running emergency management for an entire state someday," she told the director of Colorado's Emergency Management Division. "Mark my words, she's the future of this field." These national connections became increasingly important as my career developed. Emergency management is a relatively small professional community, and reputation matters enormously. Margaret's endorsements opened doors that would have remained closed to someone with my limited experience, but I had to prove myself worthy of those opportunities once the doors opened. During my second year with Bexar County, I managed my first solo disaster response when severe flooding hit the San Antonio metro area. 3 people died, and hundreds of homes were damaged, making it the most significant local disaster in several years. Dr. Santos was attending a conference out of state when the flooding began, leaving me in charge of coordinating the county's emergency response. The experience was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. I activated the Emergency Operations Center, coordinated with the National Weather Service to track the storm system, managed resource requests from multiple municipalities, and served as the primary liaison with state and federal agencies. For 72 hours, I barely slept as I coordinated rescue operations, evacuation procedures, and damage assessment activities. The response was successful by every measurable standard: no preventable deaths, efficient resource allocation, good interagency coordination, and rapid transition from emergency response to recovery operations. More importantly, I'd proven to myself and others that I could handle significant responsibility under pressure. "You handled that like someone with 10 years of experience," Dr. Santos told me during our debrief from the flooding response. "I couldn't have managed it better myself." The successful disaster response led to additional opportunities and responsibilities. I was promoted to Senior Emergency Management Coordinator and given oversight of the county's disaster preparedness programs. The new position included supervisory responsibilities for junior staff members and a larger role in strategic planning for the county's emergency management capabilities. But the most significant development during this period was Margaret's decision to accept the FEMA position in Washington, D.C. Her departure from Texas meant losing my most important mentor and advocate, but it also created opportunities for advancement that wouldn't have existed while she remained in her regional role. I'm recommending you for my replacement as Red Cross Regional Coordinator, Margaret told me during our last dinner together before she moved to D.C. You're not quite ready yet. You need another 2 years of experience, at minimum, Mice, but the position will be waiting for you when you are ready. Margaret's departure marked the end of an era in my professional development, but it also represented validation that I'd successfully transitioned from disaster victim to emergency management professional. She'd fulfilled her
commitment to help me rebuild my life after Hurricane Petra, and now I was ready to continue that rebuilding independently. You saved my life, I told her as we said goodbye at the airport. No, she replied. I helped you save your own life. There's a difference. And now you're going to help other people save theirs. As I drove back to San Antonio from the airport, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed since Hurricane Petra. The abandoned girl who'd been trapped in a flooding duplex had become a respected emergency management professional with the skills and authority to prevent other people from experiencing similar abandonment. Carlos had tried to sacrifice me to save himself, but instead he'd inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that transformed me into someone who saves others. His attempt to destroy me had ultimately made me stronger, more capable, and more purposeful than I'd ever been before. Part 9. Identity Transformation. 3 years into my career with Bexar County, I received a call that would test everything I'd learned about emergency management, family loyalty, and personal resilience. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, just as I was reviewing preparedness plans for the upcoming hurricane season. The caller identified himself as Detective Morrison from Galveston Police Department, the same detective who'd interviewed me about Carlos's abandonment after Hurricane Petra. Miss Martinez, we've located your brother, he said without preamble. He's in Harris County Jail in Houston, arrested for insurance fraud related to Hurricane Petra claims. He's asking to speak with you. The news hit me like a physical blow. After 4 years of silence, of wondering if Carlos was alive or dead, of building a life that didn't include him, he was suddenly back in my world. And characteristically, he was back because he needed something from me. What kind of insurance fraud? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. He filed claims for hurricane damage on multiple properties, including your family's duplex in Galveston. Problem is, he didn't own most of those properties, and he used false documentation to support the claims. We're talking about nearly $300,000 in fraudulent payouts. $300,000. Carlos had abandoned me to die in Hurricane Petra, then spent the next 4 years profiting from that abandonment by filing false insurance claims on the property where he'd left me to drown. The scope of his betrayal kept expanding even years after I thought I'd fully understood it. He claims he has information about the people he was involved with before the hurricane, Detective Morrison continued. Says he'll cooperate in exchange for a plea deal, but only if he can speak with you first. He insists you're the only family member who can verify certain details about his situation. I sat in my office, staring out at the San Antonio skyline, trying to process this development. The professional part of me understood that Carlos's cooperation might help law enforcement shut down whatever criminal network he'd gotten involved with. But the personal part of me wanted nothing to do with someone who'd used me as collateral for his debts and then left me to die in a hurricane. Does he know what I do for work now? I asked. He knows you work in emergency management, but I don't think he understands the level of responsibility you have. He seems to think you're still the same person he abandoned 4 years ago. That observation was telling. Carlos apparently assumed that I'd remain static while he was running his criminal enterprises, that I'd be the same vulnerable person he could manipulate and exploit.
He had no idea that his abandonment had catalyzed a complete transformation that made me stronger and more capable than he'd ever been. Dr. Santos was in her office when I knocked, and I explained the situation while she listened without interruption. Her expression grew increasingly grim as I described Carlos's latest criminal activities and his request to meet with me. "What do you want to do?" she asked. When I finished, "I want to say no and pretend this call never happened," I admitted. "But the professional part of me thinks his information might help law enforcement prevent other people from getting exploited the way I was." Dr. Santos leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. "Jessica, you've built an exceptional career and a stable life. You don't owe your brother anything, especially not after what he did to you. If seeing him again would jeopardize your emotional well-being or professional standing, the answer should be no. But if his information could shut down a trafficking operation or prevent other families from being victimized, then you consider it carefully and make the decision that aligns with your values, not his needs." After discussing it with Dr. Santos and consulting with Margaret by phone, I decided to meet with Carlos, but only under carefully controlled circumstances. Detective Morrison arranged for the meeting to take place at the Harris County Sheriff's Department, with law enforcement present and recording equipment running. I would have professional support, legal protection, and clear boundaries around what I would and wouldn't discuss. The drive to Houston took 2 hours, giving me time to prepare mentally for seeing Carlos again after 4 years. I'd changed dramatically during that time, but I had no idea how he might have changed, if at all. The Carlos I remembered was charming, manipulative, and ultimately cowardly when facing the consequences of his choices. The Carlos sitting in jail for insurance fraud might be the same person, or desperation might have transformed him into someone even worse. Harris County Jail was a massive concrete complex on the east side of Houston, surrounded by razor wire and populated with the kind of people Carlos owed money to before Hurricane Petra. Seeing him in this environment would either be poetic justice or a warning about how far he'd fallen since abandoning me. Detective Morrison met me in the lobby and escorted me through security checkpoints and locked doors to a small conference room with cameras in every corner. Carlos was already seated at a metal table, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller and older than I remembered. His hair was completely gray now, his face lined with stress and exhaustion. 4 years of living as a fugitive had aged him dramatically. When I walked into the room, Carlos looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. Relief maybe, mixed with shame and something that might have been surprise. He started to stand, as if expecting a hug or some other gesture of familial affection, but I remained near the door with my arms crossed. "Hello, Carlos," I said, keeping my voice professionally neutral. "Jess, thank God you came," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me after everything that happened. I'm here because Detective Morrison said you have information that might help prevent other people from being victimized," I replied. "This isn't a social visit." Carlos flinched at my tone, apparently realizing for the first time that I wasn't the same person he'd abandoned during the hurricane. The Jessica he remembered would have been emotional, tearful, possibly even sympathetic to his situation. The Jessica sitting across from him now was calm, controlled, and clearly uninterested in his personal welfare. "You look different," he said, studying my professional attire and confident posture. "More official." "I am different. Abandonment and betrayal tend to change people." Detective Morrison took a seat at the table and opened a recording device. "Carlos, you said you had information about the people you borrowed money from before Hurricane Petra. Information that might help us shut down their operation." Carlos glanced nervously between me and the detective. "I need to explain some things first, about what really happened before the hurricane, and why I made the decisions I did." "We know what happened," I said flatly. "You gambled away money you didn't have, borrowed from criminals to cover your losses, and when they demanded collateral, you used me as a guarantee." Then when Hurricane Petra threatened to disrupt your payment timeline, you decided I was expendable. It wasn't like that, Carlos protested weakly. Then explain what it was like. Detective Morrison said, pen poised over his notepad. Carlos spent the next hour describing his involvement with what turned out to be a sophisticated criminal organization that used gambling debts as entry points for more serious crimes. The people he'd borrowed from weren't just loan sharks, they were human traffickers who specialized in exploiting desperate people's family relationships. They told me if I couldn't pay the money back, they'd take Jessica instead. Carlos said, not meeting my eyes. Said they had buyers who preferred young women with college educations. The only way to keep her safe was to make sure she stayed where they could find her if necessary. The cold calculation behind his abandonment was even worse than I'd imagined. Carlos had left me in the path of Hurricane Petra, not just to escape his debts, but to keep me available for human traffickers if his other plans failed. He'd literally used me as bait, while he attempted to find alternative ways to pay his debts. So you thought leaving me to drown was preferable to letting them kidnap me? I asked. I thought the house would protect you until the storm passed, he said desperately. It was built to withstand hurricanes, I never thought the surge would be that bad. You knew the surge forecast was 15 feet. Our neighborhood sits at 8 feet above sea level. Basic math would have told you the first floor would flood. Carlos looked genuinely confused by this observation, and I realized he'd never bothered to learn the most basic facts about hurricane storm surge, despite living on the coast his entire life. He'd gambled with my life, based on ignorance as much as desperation. Detective Morrison pressed Carlos for specific details about the trafficking organization, names, locations, methods of operation, financial structures. Carlos provided information that would later help law enforcement identify and arrest several key figures in a network that had been exploiting families across the Gulf Coast for years. Jessica, I need you to know, I never stopped thinking about you, Carlos said as the formal interview concluded. Every day for 4 years, I wondered if you were okay, if you'd survived the hurricane, if you'd ever forgive me. If you wondered whether I'd survived, why didn't you try to find out? I asked. You could have called Red Cross Disaster Services, checked with local hospitals, contacted the police. You had dozens of ways to verify whether I was alive without exposing yourself to your creditors. Carlos had no answer for this, because the truth was that he'd convinced himself I was probably dead and used that assumption to avoid feeling guilty about abandoning me. It was easier to believe I'd died in the hurricane than to acknowledge that he'd sacrificed me to save himself. I heard about Dad, he said quietly. I'm sorry I wasn't there for the funeral. Dad died wondering where his son was, I replied. He spent his last coherent moments asking about you, worried that something terrible had happened. He never knew that you'd chosen to disappear rather than face the consequences of your actions. The meeting lasted 3 hours, and by the end I felt emotionally drained but also vindicated. Carlos's information would help law enforcement dismantle a criminal network that had victimized dozens of families. More importantly, seeing him in jail, desperate and broken, provided closure I hadn't known I needed. The brother I'd idolized was revealed to be exactly what he'd always been, Mike. A weak, selfish person who would sacrifice anyone to avoid personal consequences. As I prepared to leave, Carlos made one final attempt at manipulation. Jess, I know I made terrible mistakes, but we're still family. When I get out of prison, maybe we could try to rebuild our relationship. Start over. I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd shared my childhood, but had never truly been my family in any meaningful sense. Carlos, family doesn't abandon each other during disasters. Family doesn't use each other as collateral for debts. Family doesn't sacrifice each other to save themselves. You stopped being my family the moment you drove away during Hurricane Petra. But blood is thicker than water, he said, falling back on the oldest manipulation tactic in his arsenal. The full quote is, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. I replied. It means that relationships based on choice and commitment are stronger than relationships based on biological accident. You chose to abandon me. I've chosen to build a family with people who actually care about my welfare. Walking out of that jail, I felt a profound sense of liberation. For 4 years, part of me had wondered if Carlos might someday return with a genuine apology and explanation that would make his abandonment understandable, if not forgivable. Seeing him again confirmed that he remained the same selfish, manipulative person he'd always been, just older and more desperate. The drive back to San Antonio gave me time to process the encounter and its implications for my future. Carlos would likely spend several years in prison for his insurance fraud and other crimes. The trafficking network he'd provided information about would be dismantled. Most importantly, I could finally close the chapter of my life that had begun with his abandonment during Hurricane Petra. Dr. Santos was waiting in her office when I returned, having cleared her schedule to debrief about the meeting. I described the encounter in detail, including Carlos's explanations and my responses to his attempts at manipulation. "How do you feel?" she asked when I finished. "Relieved," I said, surprising myself with the certainty of that answer. I spent 4 years wondering if I'd been too harsh in my judgment of Carlos, if there were circumstances I didn't understand that might explain his actions. Now I know there weren't. He abandoned me because saving himself was more important to him than protecting me. Everything else is just rationalization. And you're at peace with cutting ties completely. More than at peace. I'm grateful. Carlos did me a favor by showing his true character so clearly. It freed me to build relationships with people who are actually capable of love and loyalty. 6 months after the jail meeting, I received news that Carlos had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for insurance fraud and conspiracy charges related to the trafficking operation. He'd also been ordered to pay restitution to insurance companies, though given his financial situation, actual repayment was unlikely. The same week, I received a different kind of news. Margaret was being promoted to Deputy Administrator of FEMA, making her one of the highest-ranking emergency management officials in the federal government. She called to share the news personally, and to discuss what it meant for my own career trajectory. "There will be opportunities at the federal level if you're interested," she said. "But honestly, I think you'd have more impact staying in Texas and eventually running emergency management for the entire state. You understand this region, you have credibility with local officials, and you've proven you can handle major disasters effectively." The conversation reminded me of how much my life had changed since Hurricane Petra. The abandoned girl who'd been trapped in a flooding duplex was now being discussed as a potential future director of emergency management for the second-largest state in the country. Carlos's attempt to sacrifice me had inadvertently launched me toward achievements he could never have imagined. Margaret's promotion created the opening she'd predicted for me to advance to regional coordinator for Red Cross operations. The position would involve oversight of disaster response across South Texas, coordination with state and federal agencies, and supervision of local Red Cross chapters. It was significant responsibility, but I felt ready for it. My promotion ceremony was held in the same Galveston High School gymnasium that had served as an evacuation center during Hurricane Petra. Many of the same Red Cross volunteers who'd helped during that disaster were present for the ceremony, creating a sense of full-circle completion. Margaret flew in from Washington to present me with my new credentials, and her remarks during the ceremony brought tears to my eyes. 4 years ago, I took a phone call from a young woman trapped in a flooding house during Hurricane Petra, she said to the assembled crowd. That woman is now one of the most capable emergency managers I've worked with in 25 years in this field. She exemplifies what disaster recovery really means, not just rebuilding what was lost, but building something better. After the ceremony, I drove to the empty lot where our family duplex had once stood. The concrete foundation was still there, cracked and weathered but permanent. I stood where our kitchen had been, remembering Sunday dinners with Carlos and Dad, remembering the last normal evening before Hurricane Petra changed everything. But instead of sadness, I felt gratitude. Not gratitude for the trauma, but gratitude for what had emerged from it. The career I'd built, the relationships I'd formed, the lives I'd been able to save, none of that would have existed if Carlos hadn't abandoned me and Margaret hadn't rescued me. His betrayal had become my purpose. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Santos, tornado warning issued for Fredericksburg. Can you coordinate response from the Regional Operations Center? I smiled as I typed my response. On my way. As I drove toward my first major disaster response as regional coordinator, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Carlos had tried to trade my life for his freedom, but instead he'd given me something far more valuable: the clarity that comes from surviving the worst and choosing to help others do the same. The abandoned girl was gone forever. In her place was a woman who understood that real family is built through consistent care and sacrifice, that strength comes from helping others rather than exploiting them, and that the best response to betrayal is living so well that the betrayer becomes irrelevant to your story. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.